Hi, for photo tips this month we're going to cover a topic that was sent to us by request from a viewer. In a previous episode I did on doing panoramas with your digital camera, I mentioned maintaining exposure, constant exposure on each image all the way throughout your entire panorama. Well, obviously that brought up some questions about what is exposure and how can you check it and so forth. Well, most modern cameras, digital cameras, have a feature called a histogram. A histogram is basically a graph showing the entire dynamic range. In other words, all of the information from white all the way to black in a graph form. And once you learn what the histogram is, it's real easy to take a quick glance at it and know that you got a good exposure. Most of your cameras have it nowadays, everything from the small consumer cameras all the way to the professional quality cameras that most of your photojournalists and magazine people and so forth use. The histogram's real easy to use. You basically just, after you take a picture, you're going to need to bring up the display mode, preview the picture in the viewfinder or the display of the camera, and switch the histogram on. You'll have to check your manual to see how to do that. On the small Canon here, there's a display button that brings it up. On this camera, you'll see that the histogram is in the upper right hand corner, and this was a good image because we don't have any clipping on the left or the right. Clipping is when you have too much white or too much black and you lose all of the detail in your image, so all of your data will be pushed all the way to the either left or the right hand side of the histogram. You want to maintain at least some separation between each ends to get a good quality image. The histogram on the professional camera that shows the red, green, and the blue channels are good for checking your white balance and so forth. We'll cover that in a later episode. For some examples of clipping, I'm going to load up a few pictures that I've taken in the past, and we'll load them up in Photoshop Elements just because that's mostly what I'm familiar with. Again, like I said when we first started the photo tips, we were going to use either open source or very low cost software. Photoshop Elements, if you shop around, can get it for $40 to $50, which is very reasonable and a bargain because it has a lot of the power of the full-blown Photoshop package. The GIMP is a great open source package, and it has a histogram feature in it as well. I just kind of prefer the Photoshop Elements myself. Let's take a look at a calibration chart. This chart is actually designed to calibrate your monitor so that you can see all levels from white to black. But it's also a good example of how your light meter works. The light meter in your camera is calibrated based on the 18% gray, and we'll prove it by making a new image. I'll use the eyedropper, select that color down here for our palette. We'll create a new image, and we will fill it with that color and take a look at the histogram. As you can see, the line falls right in the center of the dynamic range of the histogram. This would be a perfect exposure. Some guy a lot smarter than me decided that 18% gray was the correct calibration for the light meters on the camera, and this is what we're seeing a representation of right here. Let's take a look at a few images that I've taken in the past and see how the histogram would have looked on the camera had we previewed them at the time. This is a picture of the Washington Monument. It's a silhouette, but as you can see, we did not clip on the very edge of the histogram right here. We have a little bit on the white edge and barely to the dark edge. So overall, for the picture that we were wanting, which was a silhouette, this is a good exposure. This is an example of a nighttime exposure that is not a good exposure. We have too much black. As you can see, it's all piled up on the left side of the histogram. There's no detail in the shrubbery and so forth here. Here's one I took in San Diego, and you can see there's no clipping on the black channel, and there's really no clipping to speak of on the white channel. This is a pretty good exposure. You can tell by zooming in at the white areas on the image and see that there's still detail. If we saw clipping, you would see areas that were just solid blown out white and there would be no detail at all. This is a good image, no clipping, and we've got a good histogram centered in the middle. There could actually have been a little bit more dynamic range. It would make the image better if we went out to both ends. We have a good bit of clipping on this one in the white areas. This was a very sunny day in a high contrasty image, so it's very difficult to make this good. The clipping is in the white things of the Ferris wheel, the support of the Ferris wheel. Some of these are judgment calls. Personally, I don't care for the exposure being this bright and the clipping in it, but some people may actually think that was a decent image. I think this is probably the best example that I have. The sun was shining on the Capitol building, and it blew out, or we have clipping on the histogram because we have the blown out highlights in the center of the building where the sun was so bright, and that's represented in the right edge of the histogram right here. One last example of a good exposure. Maybe not a good image, but a good exposure. As you can see, we don't have clipping on either end. You may recognize this if you've ever watched Late Night with David Letterman and see Rupert G on there. This is the Hello Deli that Rupert owns around the corner from the Ed Sullivan Theater. There's something you need to understand a little about the light meter before you go out and take pictures, even using the histogram. If you're going to take pictures of snow, seeing this predominantly snow, a lot of white, your light meter is going to try to adjust to create an image that is 18% gray, which is what we saw on the computer a few minutes ago. Because you want the snow to be white, you're actually going to have to increase the exposure on your camera. Look in your manual and see how to do exposure compensation. Look it up in the index or in the table of contents. It's usually very easy. Increase the exposure in 1/3 or 1/2 increments. Take the picture again and check the histogram. You don't want to have clipping, but in a scene that's predominantly white, you're going to want most of the data over onto the right hand side of the histogram. So, but not all the way over so far that the white's blown out and there's no detail. It takes some trial and error, and just have fun with it, check the histogram, and pretty soon you'll start to understand what affects the exposure. And like I said at the beginning here, we're going to do segments on exposure, shutter speed, what is an f-stop, so forth, and go into a lot more detail. This should get you up and running and increase the keepers, I call them, on your pictures, and you'll end up with a lot better photographs after you learn to implement the histogram. It's very easy. You can look at the scene, glance at the histogram, and kind of know how it's supposed to be after you use it a few times. If you have any questions, you feel free to email me at tmartin@amateurlogic.tv, and I'll do my best to help you out. Until next time, use the histogram and just have some fun with it.